Hello, welcome again to Fascism on Film. Thanks for joining us. I'm James Kent, and along with me is Teal Minton.
Hi, how's it going?
I don't know if they can answer you out there, but sure. Oh, you're talking to me?
No, I was asking you how you're doing.
I'm hanging in there. And how are you doing out there in the podcasting listening universe? Hopefully you're doing okay, and that you're glad you've discovered this show, and you're anxious to hear what we're going to be talking about from week to week. And this week we are talking, as if you've caught the last episode on The Moral Storm, we mentioned 1981's Mephisto. It's kind of a weird film. It's not a German movie.
It's Hungarian, I believe.
So you have, and it's weird in America, which we're used to, movies over time where whatever country that they were portraying, you might have American actors, etc.
Right.
And they're speaking in American accents. And so here you have this Hungarian film, and it's pretty much, I don't know if it was like studio dubbed, but like whatever copies out there, it's definitely not, it's the sound is put in later, I think.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely true, which is interesting considering this central performance by Klaus Maria Brandauer as Hendrik Höfgen, the actor, is just an absolutely astounding performance. He's the actor, and he's also the actor's performances. And so you do see him on stage throughout and in a few movies here and there. And so there are several different facets to this performance that are really kind of amazing to watch. And each time I watch this film, the amount of subtlety that Brandauer brings to this character is really fascinating. So we're talking about Mephisto, which is about, it's based on a 1936 novel about it's based on a true story. This guy, Gustaf Gründgens, was an actor in Germany and did get caught up in the Nazi Hollywood, basically, and he became director of a state theater. He did a lot of theater productions. He did movies. I've watched a few of his Nazi movies, actually, and he's quite an astounding actor, really interesting to watch. And I feel like Brandauer actually captured some of what that guy does on film in a really interesting way. And so this is basically about a character who is an artist who slowly over the years loses his integrity and ultimately ends up becoming a Nazi.
I watched it first and then really had to kind of pull some teeth and say, you got to see this movie. And it's funny because I had started to watch it, and it does start off a little slow. You're not really sure where this is going. And that's because this is a film that really understands to drive home the point of the corruption of fascism. You got to start off slow. You got to understand who this guy is at the beginning of the movie and what he's all about, and how being an actor is just everything for this guy. And then, of course, parallel with the story of Mephisto and this idea of basically selling your soul to the devil. This is a movie that starts off as a slow burn, and then it just, at some point, it starts moving very fast. By the end of it, your jaw kind of drops at like, wow, what a movie this is.
Well, because it's really just chipping away at him. I don't even think Nazis are mentioned until a half an hour into the film.
Or this is what's really great about the film is through much of it, even when they start talking about what's happening in Germany, you don't see Nazi uniforms and that kind of pageantry for a long time
but then when it comes,
yes,
there is some serious pageantry. There are flags and marches and uniforms, and he is marched out to give press conferences and interviews and talk about how the arts are thriving in Germany, and he's really giving basically Nazi speeches, but about the arts. And he starts off as sort of this revolutionary Brechtian theater guy where he wants to break down the walls between theater and audience, and it's almost he's hanging out with some Bolsheviks, and he kind of likes this idea of political theater, and all of his things that he talks about in terms of theater in the beginning, and it's very similar to Brecht. All of that he says again at the end of the movie, but in the service of fascism. And so he's taken his whole artistic being and all his thoughts on art and transformed them into a tool of fascism. So it's not just like he sells out his entire art form too. And there's a really amazing point near the end of the film where he gives his interpretation of a fascist Hamlet.
Yeah.
And it's a very different Hamlet than we are used to. And he's talking about this strong Nordic man who's pure of blood. He actually uses that phrase to describe Hamlet. And it's very different than what we see. And the other place we see this in the movie is with his performance of Mephisto. And Gustaf Gründgens actually started playing Mephisto in 1932. And his last film is a filmed version of Mephisto from 1960. And so, yeah, Gustaf Gründgens did continue to act after World War II. So his initial performance of Mephisto is very energetic and kind of baroque and over the top. And then his Nazi Mephisto is much more commanding and controlled. And so he actually changes his performances based on the ideology.
Just like the other films that we've started out with, Cabaret and The Mortal Storm, this film really covers what was happening in Germany in the last stages of the Weimar Republic into Hitler taking over. You get a taste, but from the theatrical world, kind of, and I think that's important that this film isn't trying to like go and do a catch-all of everything that was happening in Nazi Germany. It stays in its lane of showing just how fascism altered the world of art. And I think, again, I'm always thinking in terms of what does a film from 1981 that has something to say about 1930s, but now looking at it in the world that we live in today, it asks these questions, right? And again, I don't know where these things are headed, but I have to go with something that, currently happens. And Hollywood right now, with its many challenges, is being asked to essentially make movies here in America or face all sorts of crazy things. So you see a government willing to push its will against an industry and say, do it our way. And the question will be, well, how will it adapt? And so in Germany, once the Nazis take power, you essentially could only have certain kinds of plays by certain kinds of more Aryan type.
In fact, there's a scene in the movie where he's complaining about how there's no good German playwrights. And so they have to do Shakespeare because he's only allowed to do German plays. And he's like, there aren't any good ones.
And that happens with the music. And then suddenly you're also seeing the aesthetics of like the sculptures, how basically Brandauer or Höfgen, he starts falling in with the sort of elite benefactors who were, say, theater patrons, but now they're Nazi theater patrons.
Well, there's a very important character in this film called the General or the Prime Minister, and he is based on Hermann Göring.
Yes, and he even he looks like Hermann Göring.
He looks like Hermann Göring, and he becomes, in a way, he almost adopts the character, the main character, and it treats him as a little bit of an amusement or a plaything. Oh, I've got this actor, and I can send him out to do little propaganda things for me. But he starts to believe that, Höfgen starts to believe that maybe he is important and has some power, and he tries to, at times, help out some people that work in the theater that are being persecuted. And there's a point at which, and so the general gets to him not by imposing ideology on him, but through flattery.
Well, he becomes like he's the devil in the Mephisto.
Well, he even says Mephisto is a German national, but don't tell anyone.
Yeah. Because the general is in some ways like very nefarious, but also charming. And
he's charming, yes. Yeah, and then there's a point at which Höfgen goes, "Hey, I need some help with this guy you're trying to send to a concentration camp," and he goes, And the general's like, "Oh, who the hell do you think you are? Get out of here, actor. This is way above your pay grade." And he just kicks him out of the office. And that's sort of the point at which he realizes, oh, I don't actually have any power. I am just kind of here to perform for these people's amusement and for their sort of edification to make German culture look great on the world stage. He's a piece of propaganda, and everything he does, he's very personal about his production of Hamlet at the end. He really believes in what in this portrayal of Hamlet that he's going to do. He really believes it. It's not just something that he's doing because they told him to.
Yeah, but he also thinks he's more clever than the regime. And he at some points thinks that his fame that he's achieved in Germany is so important that it will protect him.
Yes.
And that,
oh, yes.
And that basically, by the end, that illusion is shattered. One of the other aspects that show kind of his personality and maybe how he thinks he's in command of everything, and I'm talking again about Brandauer's character, is his relationships throughout the movie. He's kind of a womanizer. And the different women in his life represent, I think, facets of his belief system. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about his real pure true love, who is
his real true love is this character called Juliet, who is German. She's half black, and clearly that is not something the Nazis are going to be down with. But he sort of thinks he can keep her around. He's married to somebody else, but she's also his dance teacher. I would say that the times in the movie when he's the happiest and the most himself are when he's dancing. And so his first scene with Juliet, they dance and make love. And it's, I feel like that's where he's most himself, actually, is with her.
Well, right. He wears so many masks in this movie. The question for the audience becomes, is there a real Hendrik Höfgen out there? And if so, can we identify what is the most true to what he really is, that spirit of who he really is as a person? And I think the person he imagines himself to be, or the one he wants to be, is the person who's with Juliet.
Yeah, I mean, okay, we can debate that, but yeah, I think that he's definitely more himself when he's with her. And of course, she can't stay in Germany, and he thinks he can sort of step in to save her, and the general does allow him to keep her around for a little while. And then finally the general says, "No, this is over. It's done. Enough with this black woman." And we're sending her. But Höfgen does manage to get her sent safely out of the country.
Well, that's another fascinating aspect that kind of ties in the history of Germany, because the first time the two of them are together in these early stages, when we haven't really been hearing anything about the rise of Nazi Germany, that again, it harkens back to Cabaret, and that there was a time when nobody was thinking anything inappropriate about this woman being black and having, like, being a dancer, and there was nobody bothering her. And then suddenly, after the Nazis take over, suddenly she is a problem. And she's not going to have rights. And it really, even though they don't dwell on these things heavily in the plot, these things really stick out to me in that, isn't it amazing that because of a government coming into place, things that you just had freedoms for one day, you no longer have. And I think that's a key to really, for us to think about when we are debating whether we are an authoritarian government or versus a democracy. And we have to weigh whether or not people we know or us, we had freedoms in January, at the beginning of January, that we may not have today. That's a question.
Part of what films like this do is, by putting a character through these questions, through these moral dilemmas, it's asking us to make those same reflections. Would we stand up at this point, or would we acquiesce and go along with it? And, with Juliet, she escapes, right? So she's not fighting back against it, but she does escape, whereas he has this option, and he has several options to leave the country.
I'm glad you bring this up, because that was going to be my next thing that I wanted to have you discuss, is the fact that he's not somebody stuck in Nazi Germany.
No,
he has opportunities.
He has many opportunities to leave. His wife leaves, and she says, "Why are you still there?" He says, "I need the German language." And that's and I think that was true of people like Emil Jannings and Heinrich George too, who were silent actors who couldn't survive in talkies because they spoke German. And so that's a real thing, that he felt like the only way he could express himself and be himself as an actor is in the German language. And because of that, he refuses to leave. But he is constantly making these little moral equivocations about how much he acquiesces and how much he doesn't, and how much he's trying to maintain his own artistic integrity while not doing that at all and basically just becoming a pawn of the regime. There's another character, and there's lots of these little characters sort of throughout the film. There's a Nazi movie star that he sort of gets into an affair with. There's a character named Hans, who's sort of this radical young actor in the beginning who becomes a Nazi. And in fact, Höfgen at one point says that this Nazi movie star is a bad actress, and this guy gets so offended he almost starts a fist fight over it. How dare you? How dare you insult a Reich movie star? And this guy becomes a Nazi, and then he's not. Höfgen doesn't think this guy is a great actor and kicks him out of the acting troupe. And the guy gets a job teaching Hitler Youth how to do speeches and stuff. And eventually this guy also becomes an anti-Nazi and gets taken away and disappeared. And Höfgen sort of watches all this happen, is somehow responsible for it, takes no responsibility.
Yeah, because he didn't like him. He hated him as an actor. So he
hated him as an actor. And so but these little petty things and the ways in which it sort of chips away. I mean, this character, it's a 2.5-hour movie, and this character is just slowly chipped away at. Throughout the course, he chips away at himself, I guess, is one way to put at it. But his psychology is really interesting to me, because he's not just. I think it's a too simple a reading of the film to say that he's ambitious and makes a deal with the devil to fulfill his dreams. I think that underneath that ambition is a huge amount of insecurity and shame and humiliation. And that hole in him is being filled by fascism that makes him feel important. And that sense of humiliation and insecurity and shame is sort of the fertile ground, the fertile psychological ground in which fascism can grow. And so it's warning us about being that type of character also.
What you just said is very interesting, in that, without mentioning any particular political parties, one party really wasn't offering the masses anything other than kind of what you said, the ability for you to feel better than the guy that we're about to step on. And
exactly, yeah.
That's a powerful tool in fascism.
It absolutely is.
They can't offer you economic benefits to really any large degree. There's really going to be a lot of corruption at the top, but you are going to get a chance to feel good about the fact that you're going to stomp on somebody else.
Exactly. And those feelings of humiliation and shame and insecurity will be dealt with through that anger.
Yeah, because there will always be a rationale. You shouldn't feel too bad for those people whose jobs are now gone, or those people that we are trying to throw out of the country, because
there's this whole other question here about, does art transcend politics? And, I see this sometimes now with people saying, well, I'm not, I'm not into the politics. I just do this, right? And he keeps trying to make that argument, but the argument the film makes is that everything he does is political, and that you can't separate, that art by its very nature is political. And you can't separate it out and say, oh, this, and he does this at one point. He says, well, I'm going to perform Hamlet whether they like it or not. And his wife says, well, Shakespeare is what they use to show they're not as bad as we think they are.
Yeah.
And so even Shakespeare is put in service of fascism. And that's so art is not neutral, is one of the arguments the film is making. In addition to the character stuff about, insecurity and self-deception and the masks, there's also all these other elements going on, moral questions, fascist aesthetics. And I think this film still matters. I think it really dramatizes some key elements of authoritarianism.
Oh, absolutely it does. And, though not mentioned in the film, Joseph Goebbels, well, he knew art mattered. And
Yes.
he used, films as a propaganda tool for the masses.
Yeah, and there are a few scenes in this where Höfgen is acting in films. It's a really interesting thing. At one point, there's this scene late on when the general, the Hermann Göring character, says, "I think I figured." He calls him Mephisto, actually, and sometimes he calls him Hamlet, but he calls him by the character names. He says, "Mephisto, I think I figured you out. I figured out your performance." He says, "You do surprise." And it's true that this is what Brandauer's doing through these performances is he's putting in pauses, he's speeding up language, he's slowing it down, he's doing sort of unexpected facial expressions in the middle of stuff, and he's kind of keeping the audience on edge. And he continues to do that. Well, he does that less and less over the course of the film as he becomes more sort of rigid in his performances.
Ultimately, we know that, fascism does not really lend itself to artistic expansion.
Not at all. I actually wrote down this quote. I'm just going to read you a little bit of it. This is him pitching to the Nazis his version of Hamlet at the end of the movie. "The Prince of Denmark renounces rank, youth, and love. He is the savior of the North. The lonely knight with lofty ideals, the ideal of purity of blood and race." And then he goes on to talk about how Hamlet is conflicted and that this is a lesson to Germany, is that we shouldn't be conflicted or reflect too much between action and inaction because we need to just take action.
I think that he's looking at how do I sell still being able to do Hamlet to the Nazis.
But that's really the question we're left with in the film is how much of his thinking has been corrupted, how much of it is just for show, how much of it is mask, how much is he trying to slide by them, how complicit is he? Is there a point at which it doesn't matter if you are thinking freely as long as you're acting with complicity? And the very end of the film, he just says, "What do you want from me? I'm an actor." As though he's just a vehicle for or a conduit for the content. And I guess that's sort of what he ends up being, as opposed to somebody who writes the words. He's just somebody who acts out the ideology.
And he, of course, like I said, discovers the hard way that when the regime has no more use for you.
Yeah, you are right being put out to pasture if the regime has no use for you. Well, this guy survived the regime. He survived the regime and
in real life.
Yes, I guess that's true.
They leave it a little open-ended, but I would think it's pretty obvious what happens to his character at the end of the movie. But
yeah, I think so too. And the movie, the novel came out in 1936, so clearly it doesn't cover his whole career.
Well, wasn't his sister or something married to the guy?
I believe so. Yeah,
the real the real. But that's the thing is this movie is 44 years old. Probably not super easy to find. Maybe pop in on Canopy and see if you can find it. But I think that it's worth checking out, even if maybe you saw it years ago. You should look at it again because this isn't an American. This is the first film that we're talking about that's not an American film.
Yeah,
and the other countries and their takes on fascism, I think, as we go through this journey, are very important, especially when we get into European films that were a lot closer to the action, so to speak, than America. And there's a lot of filmmakers that will cover that, as I said it in our introduction episode, where either they lived through it or they were little kids at the time or they had relatives, etc., but they, have a little bit more closer proximity to what happened in Europe in the 40s. And their takes are pretty interesting.
Their takes are very interesting. And this, this is a really remarkable film, again, because there's so little violence in it.
Yeah.
That it's really a question about fascism and the mind. And there's one scene where he comes out of the theater and there are some SIA guys beating up a Jewish guy in the street. And he looks at it. He watches this for a second until one of the Nazis comes up and stares at him. and he just turns around and quickly walks away and ignores what he's seeing. And that, I think, might be the only moment of violence in the film. And he, of course, is ignoring it. And so it really asks us what we would do in these situations where we're not necessarily confronted with violence. He's not physically threatened really at any point during the movie, and he continues to give up pieces of himself and pieces of his integrity. And for me, what's so powerful is just watching him go through this as an observer and sort of saying, no, don't do that. But at the same time, constantly reflecting on myself. And I guess maybe I'm being too much like Hamlet and reflecting, but I reflect on what I would do in this situation. And if I was an artist, would I say, no, I'm not sacrificing my art. I have integrity and I'm willing to be exiled for it, as many other people were, many other writers, at one point, like the German, not enough good German plays, it's because they've all left.
Yes.
All the good writers have escaped already. So for me, what it is watching this film is really that personal reflection on what I would do in that situation where I'm confronted with complicity or resistance.
Yeah. And those are tests that, we don't know what we're going to be facing in the future, and what will we do?
And what will we do? And these films can help us reason through those things and find who would we have been in that situation? Which character would we have been? And I don't think I would have been him, because I don't necessarily think I would have stood up and resisted. I probably would have fled. But
I think I would be on the fled side if I had the opportunity to.
Well, and he has the opportunity. He has multiple opportunities, and I think I would have taken one of those opportunities.
It was something you said, and I think that's interesting for you, the listener.
Yeah.
Again, we don't know who you are and we don't know what your political affiliations are, but let's just say that you are more right-leaning or right. And if you take the challenge and watch these movies, those are the questions you need to ask yourself. If you find yourself not going along with fascism in these movies, and you're finding it sympathetic to the other side, and you think that you're right, these are terrible things going on, then you may have to reevaluate what's going on in your political beliefs today. I mean, see what matches up, or what fiction you're creating for yourself or not. And any of these things. That's where, like you said, when I watch these movies, if they challenge me, I am asking myself, what would I do in a similar situation? And again, for most of my history, it was only imagination. I didn't have to come up against anything real.
Well, and you just said something really key, which is these fictions that we create. And this movie, in large part, is a guy creating new fictions over and over again to justify what he's doing, and telling himself these narratives that he's doing the right thing, that he's a good guy. And he isn't. He isn't a good guy. He's not one of these, he's not the Hermann Göring character, and he's not one of these Nazis with a scar on his face cackling in glee, in sadistic glee, but he is just as bad.
Exactly. Again, people, if you can see Mephisto, highly recommend. It gives you a much more unique take on fascism than some of the other films that might jump into your head. So, Teal, what do we have coming up on our next episode?
Okay, so our next episode is a little heavy. We're going to be talking about Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, the famous Nazi propaganda film / documentary, and that sort of creates an ecstatic ritual out of a Nazi convention, out of marches, out of music, and really is... I tell people sometimes, if you want to know what Nazis are like, take their word for it and watch this movie, because they leave no doubt about who they are.
Do we have to? No, I'm just kidding. Yes, we do have to.
We do have to, but this is one of those ones where I don't recommend it that people watch. I highly recommend Mortal Storm, Mephisto, but I don't recommend Triumph of the Will. I think it's an unpleasant experience, and you shouldn't go through it for anything other than scholarly interest.
Well, here's something fascinating. People may or may not realize that they have seen this movie, or maybe parts, because And until you go through and watch it yourself, you don't realize that so much of the footage that we have of sort of the ideal image of Nazi
Yes.
rallies and political speeches, adulation to Adolf Hitler and crowds, they are all been grabbed from this film.
Yes.
I was shocked at just how much footage that I had seen just based on history documentaries.
Many World War II documentaries feature images straight out of this and are just replatforming Nazi propaganda. That's the crazy thing about it, is that the film is actually still around and still being watched because there are clips of it shown everywhere.
And it's also become a template for Nazi aesthetics, because filmmakers, when they want to evoke fascism imagery, they will quite often take angles and shots from
Yes.
this film in order to make a point, because people somehow know, based on this is a film that teaches fascist language.
That's exactly it. Fascist aesthetic language.
So we'll get into that on next episode.
Sounds good.
All right. So again, fascismonfilm.com. You can find all our episodes there, and also Podbeam, Apple Podcasts, and then other podcast outlets. But thank you again for joining Teal and I, and we look forward to our next episode with you.
Thanks for listening.